So let's talk about this cashless society aspect. Now, Chris in Surrey, who was talking to us just before the break, he is very kindly going to hang on while we talk to Connor Tomlinson, who's a political commentator. Connor, an absolute pleasure to have you on the programme. How are you doing?
Good to be back. Thanks very much, Peter. We have talked about this for like about a year ago.
Yeah, we did talk about it a year ago, but it's reared its head again because central banks the world over are still looking at introducing these CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, and there is thought that it could happen in the UK. Just bring us up to date in terms of what you think could happen and why we should be worried about this.
But we should be worried about it because the landscape has changed. It's gotten even worse and more fertile ground to introduce a central bank digital currency that is a digital currency that the government can manipulate, inflate and confiscate at any time for any arbitrary reason, because we're in much more dire financial straits than we were this time a year ago. If you look at the graphs, the interest rates are trending and the inflation is trending about the same as it was in 2009, just after the financial crash, and it's still climbing upwards. And also the Bank of England's going to be in charge of this, and I don't think we should trust the Bank of England when it continually gaslights the public into thinking it's done a good job and that it didn't have any role in this inflation. We keep hearing about how the inflation is caused by coming out of lockdown and the gas prices of Ukraine, and nothing about the monetary policy from both the Treasury and the Chancellor, was Rishi Sunak at the time, and the Bank of England to inject into the money supply an abundance of money to pay for the furlough scheme under quantitative easing. Instead, they say that, oh, inflation's coming down year on year, when instead, if you just look at this time last year, like in May, when they said inflation was coming down, and they said, oh, the inflation's been knocked off by about 3 percentage points. Well, it turns out they just took in energy prices out of the basket of goods they were calculated as being inflated, because we're propping those up with tax for the energy price cap guarantee. So the Bank of England aren't being honest. They've engineered a scenario where the economy is in such dire straits that it looks like the pound could collapse. And so now they've created a problem through which CBDCs is the solution. So my curiosity is always, why are they so insistent on this? Is it just that it's the inevitability of the tech, or do they want to use it to surveil and control us?
Talking about surveillance and control, you mentioned there that money could be taken out of your account in theory for any arbitrary reason. I mean, surely there will be safeguards around that. I know, and the reference has been made already to the absolutely shameful actions of Justin Trudeau and his government in Canada. Oh, look at me with my lovely bouncy hair and my silly socks. I'm just a wonderful cuddly person. Well, Justin, you took out the money from bank accounts of truckers who failed to get the vaccine because you wanted them to get the vaccine. I'm very pro-vaccine. I've had all my jabs. In fact, I'm immunosuppressed, so I probably have more jabs than most people because I'm in a vulnerable category. But at the same time, if you don't want to have the vaccine, it should be your decision, and there should be no sanction if it doesn't happen to you. So this has happened in terms of the Canadian government acting in a ridiculous way, taking money, and a shameful way, taking money out of people's accounts. How much of this really feeds in realistically, do you think, Connor, to the kind of social credit ideas and the idea that you could be sanctioned for not doing quite the right thing?
Well, the reason that Justin Trudeau manufactured consent to sanction the truckers is because he turned around and at one of the protests, there was someone with his face covered up carrying a Nazi flag walking into the middle of it. And the rest of the protesters rounded on him and kicked him out. But he said, oh, this entire movement is far right, therefore it's hateful. Therefore, under Canada's hate speech legislation, we'll be able to crack down on this and crack down on the people that are funding it. And so we know throughout history that people have used agent provocateurs to infiltrate well-meaning protests like Occupy Wall Street or the early 2000s, it might have been the 90s actually, with the World Trade Center protests, with the construction of it. And so we know people will derail good-natured protest movements if they are well-funded, and therefore manufacture the ability to smear them as the worst possible thing on earth and use it as a pretext to debank them. And Sadiq Khan the other day called the ULEZ protesters far-right, fascists, and some of them are Tories, conflating his opponents with the worst possible people on earth. So all it takes to...
He also said people who were against ULEZ were like COVID deniers.
Yes, exactly. So all it takes is for propaganda to smear your political opponents as something you've already defined as objectionable in law. Just say, oh, well, don't worry, I'll only debank the racists. Well, if you just keep crying wolf and stretch the definition, then suddenly anyone that doesn't want to pay ULEZ is suddenly a racist. So,
well, I mean, you know, Gina Miller was debanked, for example. I mean, this is not just people on the right. That's a slightly different issue. But there's a really good article recently by two members of the House of Lords who, in the Times, talking about how an inquiry by the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee concluded last year that they had not heard a good reason why the UK needs a digital pound. How close are we to a cryptocurrency, a digital pound, here in the UK specifically, Connor, and what are the moves in that direction?
Well, I think the technology is currently being better conducted in the private sphere, but over in the States, they are exploring at a state level, thanks to Biden's recent executive order, ACBDC, and trying to fold things like Ethereum, or there was a Tether coin, that are currencies that are backed by the US dollar already, and sort of parasitizing that technology. What they really want is the blockchain technology, which is the ability to go back right from the start of the currency where it's created and trace every transaction and every hand it has been held in.
The thing with cash is that you can spend it anonymously. You can get out £100 from a bank account or even £10 and spend it on whatever you want. Whereas there is a digital footprint with, and even more so, isn't there, with a cryptocurrency, even more so than card transactions?
Exactly. And so you can see everything that someone has spent things on. And so you can build up a customer portfolio for what they're likely to spend things on. And so if you want them to have their carbon emissions capped because you don't want them to buy another flight again, or if they're shopping at a business which has put up a verboten tweet and it's been critical of the government, suddenly they're not going to be able to spend their money. And we know this is actually
do we know that will definitely happen, Connor? Do you think this is definitely... a lot of those hypotheticals saying that they'll take... people send tweets all the time, and businesses send tweets all the time that are critical of the government. Some people will say that actually you're scaremongering here.
So it's twofold. First of all, in 2015, there was a document called Blueprint for a Digital Identity, and it was in collaboration with pretty much all the major banks, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Australian government, and the UK Cabinet Office at the time. And they said about the development of a digital wallet, of a digital citizen's ID, so you can vote and pay taxes, and a digital consumer ID, so it was linked up with their corporate partners, so they'd be able to build a portfolio on you. And what that means is, under environmental social governance scores, the corporate woke social credit system that allows companies that sign on to it to get subsidies from the hedge funds, propping up international institutions, the customer becomes a liability rather than an asset for the company. And so your tweets could be a liability for the businesses you shop at, so the businesses have the incentive to stop you shopping at it. And this is what happened with Nigel Farage. You saw in Coutts Bank's annual earnings report, they were sitting down and saying, we have ESG scores, our partner BlackRock dictates that we must be diverse, inclusive and net zero. And that's why they drew up a 40-page report on all of Nigel Farage's tweets, which weren't diverse and inclusive in their own words. So you're going to start getting people being exiled from banks and businesses that don't have the platforms of Farage and so don't have the ability to speak out and be rebanked.
Pete in Wales has been in touch on text. He says, I agree with a cashless society. It's harder to commit crimes such as drug dealing. It would increase tax income from small businesses and tradesmen who are able to hide cash income from their accounts. I know tradespeople nearing retirement who have never paid income tax in their lives. No surprise the UK is bankrupt. But at the same time, people love convenience, do they not, Connor? Many people carry no cash, pay for everything via their phone. Even cards are starting to feel a bit updated in some ways. I know a lot of people who don't carry a wallet at all. Some people will like digital currency, will they not? They'll embrace it.
They'll embrace it because they think it's convenient until they realize how easily manipulated it is. And this is part of the argument they're using about the technology. They keep saying it's inclusive, but as we know, every time they say inclusion, they mean exclusion by any other means. And so this is going to exclude elderly people that don't have a smartphone, or people that just can't understand how to use the technology, that aren't as digitally literate as people in their 40s, 20s and teens. And also the idea that everything in the economy should be reorganized about the trickle up of paying tax is why we've got the largest tax burden, is why we haven't got very much economic growth in terms of GDP per head, and is why the numbers keep being fudged by the Bank of England to make themselves look good so that people don't lose votes eventually.
I think you make a lot of really good points, Connor, and I am very concerned by what you're talking about, but I do think that there are millions of people who just won't care. I think there are people who are happy, they just don't really have a real thought about freedom necessarily, who were keen on vaccine passports. They were keen even on vaccine mandates. They won't be overly worried by social credits. They'll say things like, if you stick to the rules, you won't be cancelled.
Yeah, and until it affects them, because the ratcheting effect of what you can and cannot say against ESG, diversity, equity and inclusion, keeps expanding, they won't care until the crocodile comes for them next.
And what about being hacked as well? Craig in Durham says, if we go cashless, what happens if people get hacked?
Who knows? Genuinely, you're reliant on the government safeguards then, but then, of course, if the government has a backdoor ability to confiscate your currency at any time because you might be a criminal, for example, whether that's thought crime or actual crime, then that is liable to manipulation, yeah.
Just one more question. I actually just want to read out what Jane says here on text. Hi, Peter. There must never be a cashless society. We must push back. So many don't realise what they will mean. Keep talking about this, Peter. Keep talking about this, Connor, as well. I wonder if there is some link here with COVID restrictions, with lockdown, and the innovations like the COVID passport, the move away from that cash. Did that accelerate things in terms of the currency, digital currency movement? Because it has been around for some years, but I wonder if the two are linked in any way.
I would say so, because you've got the digital infrastructure there. New York have actually explored using their COVID passport ID as a digital ID for their citizens and also a digital wallet. So it almost makes the soil more fertile for its adoption. And one of the keenest people on this is, of course, Tony Blair. Now, he's very chummy with the incumbent Prime Minister at this point, Keir Starmer. Both Tony Blair and Keir Starmer are permanent fixtures of Davos. Keir Starmer said he prefers Davos to Westminster. And the World Economic Forum, who are leading the UK's AI regulation, are also hot on digital currencies and have been since 2015 when they did that document with the UK's Cabinet Office. They're the architects behind ESG. They're the framework that Farage got debanked for. So I think we need to devolve power from these digital institutions and these unaccountable banks and say to the public, well, do you want this? And I would be shocked if people, if they understood the implications of it, would say yes.